All right, we have almost as many people on the panel as in the audience for this session. May I start by asking if any of the panelists wish to say anything more than they've said up to this point? I'll abuse my privilege while you think of your questions to just add a little bit more in response to Mr. House's query. I think Monsieur Sedin doesn't understand how bad it is in the United States if he thinks it is bad in France. One day on the right bank, my wife wanted to buy I think a Simenon book, and we went into a small, primarily literary bookstore on the right bank. I, of course, left her in the literary part and went to the philosophy section, which was only about this big. And there were 8 books of Leo Strauss, all translated by you, I suspect, including books that don't exist in English, like the Scholem Correspondence or the collection of essays on history and political philosophy or the Nihilism collection. So Strauss is, I don't know anything about sales figures, maybe you do, but the books seem more present there, and including, as I say, books that don't even have an English equivalent. There's also the collection of essays on Maimonides, the collection of essays on Spinoza, which also have no English equivalents. Questions, comments? I know there are other people here who studied with Strauss at various times and who we haven't heard from. There's a hand there.
No,
Mr. Zinman.
And Nathan hasn't even mentioned all of the books that he himself has written and will publish under Strauss's name. But on the, I do.
Where's that scalpel?
Listening to a colleague from France made me think that it'd be worth, at a conference on Leo Strauss's teacher, mentioning the fact that the whole situation of Leo Strauss's teacher has been transformed in the last, well, I would say 2 decades, maybe even more recently than that. And I don't mean simply that publishing on Strauss has now become a cottage industry. In fact, you know, if you're not writing a book on Strauss, you may have something to worry about. I mean something very different. During my lifetime, until recently, in the United States, it was very rare to find people who were profoundly influenced by Strauss, who were not students of Strauss in the flesh, or students of Strauss, or students of Strauss in the flesh. Very, very few people that I know of were profoundly influenced by Strauss who didn't have direct contact or indirect contact of the kind I mentioned. I mean, one such person, and even he is the kind of exception to the Prue's rule, was Harvey Mansfield, who never really studied with Strauss, but who grew up in a political science department where Harry Jaffa was an important figure, and Harvey's father was the chair of the department, and also did have a seminar with Strauss early on in his career at Berkeley. But it was very hard to find people, certainly people who were well known in the United States, who were influenced by Strauss, but who hadn't had direct or indirect contact with him. And that was one of the reasons why I think many people were very suspicious of Straussians, because, after all, isn't there something wrong with a teacher who is also a writer, but whose influence seems to require the laying on of the hands or something approaching that? And of course, there must be, and so you had all these students who were very smart, often very gifted, and very grateful to Strauss, and who were buddies with one another. And, you know, from the outside, there was no question, and maybe from the inside, that there was something a little strange about this. And it seems to me that it is extremely important for those people who care about Strauss's project and his thought that now there are people studying Strauss seriously, writing about Strauss seriously, all over the world who never had any contact with Strauss or Straussians. Or now it's true that you do occasionally get a strange invitation from China, and you wonder, oh my God, I mean, this must be, is this good that there are now nests of Straussians in China? Or is this bad? But I think that is a profound change in the whole intellectual world. And I think it's also likely to continue. And France, the French are very recalcitrant. Who knows how long it'll take? But I find this very encouraging, and I think in some ways it helps combat the notion of Straussianism in the worst sense of the term.
And of course, those of us interested in Strauss's writing have been enormously indebted in recent years to work done abroad, above all Heinrich Mayer's Gesammelte Schriften that made many things available, which, like the transcripts, had not all been published by Strauss, and the work of David Janssens, Daniel Tanguay, and others. I'm aware of about a dozen people in writing dissertations on Strauss, none of them in this country, but in Spain and Portugal and France and Germany and Austria and Israel, and doing postdoctoral work in Argentina on the subject. And I forget what's it called, Steve, the Google stats or something? We know which, of the thousands of people who have visited our website, we know which of them reached it through Google and how many of them reached it through the Chinese search engine, which is a significant proportion, as I recall.
The gentleman from the University of Chicago Press that you all were picking on yesterday, I can't remember his name, but I was at the table with him last night for dinner, and he said what Professor Tarko, I'm sure you know, that the real growth market, the booming market for Strauss books is in China. He said it's unbelievable, the number of books that are published and bought in China on Strauss.
Well, as the Social Network's opening line says, there are more people with genius IQs in China than there are people in the United States, or something like that. Mr. Minowitz?
Thank you, Mr. Minowitz. Just to follow up directly on what Mr. Zinman just said, to tie it into a few other things, you had mentioned yesterday, or was it this morning? This morning, that your teachers would have were flabbergasted that you were going to write a dissertation on Strauss, and it would have been unthinkable that would have happened had Strauss still been alive. Harvey Mansfield, who you just mentioned, wrote within the last year or two, or relatively recently, that Strauss, unlike Rawls and comparable figures, forbade his students to write about him. And Mr. Lenzer, you mentioned perhaps it's better to think of him as a facilitator of study rather than an object of study. So I would just like to direct this to the entire panel and everybody else here who has a comment on this. How exactly did Strauss communicate hostility to having his students work on him? And this is of particular relevance to me, who's gotten embroiled in some of the controversies about whether Strauss had a secret teaching in his books, in his publications.
Well, just briefly, I mean, I think that I addressed that to a certain extent. I mean, he really did point you in the classes. It just would not occur to you if you saw him on a regular basis telling you, study Plato, study Hobbes, study Machiavelli, and doesn't point to himself at all, doesn't offer you a clue, a wink. Hey, you're right. It just makes sense that the students would do what their masterful teacher was telling them, that this is the proper way to go. Study somebody genuinely great. I'm very good. You're not, but one day maybe.
Mr. Gurevich?
he may have discouraged students from writing about him, but I would be surprised if many of his students' dissertations did not, in fact, convey his teaching. I certainly know that that was very much the case in with my dissertation, and my outside reader sent a note to Strauss saying, "I'd expect nothing different from a student of yours," more or less. And I dare say that that was probably true of a great many of my contemporaries, so that it was as if more insidious. That's all I want to say on the subject.
Mr. Gilden?
I wonder how unusual that was. I mean, would a student of Morgenthau have thought of proposing a dissertation on Morgenthau, or a student of David Green thought of proposing a dissertation on David Green? I just don't think it was done.
But there's a sort of in-between, which is to say you could have, Rawlsians write about Rawlsian topics on the issues he addressed in his own name, not about authors he wrote about. And most of Strauss's students wrote dissertations on authors he wrote about rather than the main issues that he discusses in his own writing. You don't see dissertations on exoteric writing, or dissertations on the theological political problem, or dissertations on natural right. I may be unaware of some. But if I can follow this up to those of you who did write dissertations with him, we have at least 4 of them there. Well, did he suggest topics? How did did he point you what to do? What was he like as a dissertation supervisor? We've all been talking primarily, except for a few remarks by Mr. Lerner, about him as a classroom teacher or a person who talked to you in his office. But what effect did he have on your dissertations?
Well, I thought I said...
But you didn't say anything about yourself. You stated it all very abstractly, Mr. Lerner.
Well, I suppressed the first person singular, but the point is that subjects were proposed to people. I think I had said something to this effect in terms of their comparative advantage, whether it was linguistic or temperamental. So there was to be a fit, as it were.
So it's not a matter of his responding to your proposal, but he actually said you should write about Zionism, Mr. Lerner?
Look, when he learned that I knew Hebrew at a certain level, and Hebrew grammar, albeit of the biblical variety, he thought this was something that could be parlayed into study of medieval texts, none of which I had ever read. I mean, these things weren't taught. And so then I tried. Yeah, and he suggested a way. That was my introduction to Maimonides, by looking at the prehistory of political Zionism, though the focus of it was supposed to be on Pinsker and Herzl and, Nordau and people of that sort of the late 19th and early 20th century. But that's what got me in. He obviously knew where I was going once he showed me.
And Charney Como to this point?
I'm afraid so. I was very excited about the relationship between the Nicomachean Ethics and the Magna Moralia, and I saw all kinds of changes and all kinds of things that made them very interesting. And so I went to Mr. Strauss and I said, I would like to do ethics and Magna Moralia. And he said, oh, no, you'll run into all kinds of authenticity questions and that sort of thing. Instead, compare the ethics with the politics, okay? Which is why it took me a very long time to finish my dissertation.
Did you want? No, but there were other dissertation writers here whom I was hoping to promote. Mr. Gilden. Mr. Gilden.
Well, he suggested writing on Shaftesbury. I said, well, how about the political philosophy of Leibniz, which I tried for a couple of years until I recognized that it was impossible. And then I ended up writing on the theological political treatise of Spinoza.
Mr. Schultzky?
No, well, in my case, it's a little different because the effective chairman of my committee was actually Professor Cropsey, but sort of for reasons of decency, I think, and reverence. You know, Strauss was always made the chairman, but, yeah, so he didn't really say anything about it.
I wonder whether Ray Weiss wants to say anything about that.
Ray Weiss. Mr. Strauss recommended the topic of my dissertation very, very explicitly. It concerned the relationship between Chachma, wisdom, and Chassidut, piety, in the Mishnah Torah. There's an apparent, a real conflict there, and he told me to go after it, and I did. And he was also, I might add, very generous in his guidance and seeing me whenever I had something to talk to him about. Once he even called me from his home on a Saturday afternoon, and he said he told me he came across a passage which would be of great interest to me, and he gave me one of the keys to my dissertation, and I was, of course, grateful.
Mr. Nagorski?
Well, I just simply want to confirm the general pattern here in that Mr. Strauss specifically suggested my dissertation topic to me based, as Ralph Lerner has said, on language abilities at that time and some interest I had shown in especially the course of '62, where he considered passages from Cicero's Laws and the De Republica, and he said there's a lot of work to be done on the relationship between Cicero's major and direct political teachings and the text we had considered and his rhetorical writings. He said, go read the De Oratore and write something for me on it. And so I wrote him a paper on it, kind of outside the course framework. We met and we discussed it, and that was the direction of my work finally.
And just, in a way, just repeating what Mr. Lenzner said earlier, that his teaching, my impression, is that his teaching, and therefore the tapes and transcripts, do not constitute part of his oeuvre. They were not designed by him to contribute to what he was doing, to contribute directly or to be a part of what he was doing in his published writings. They do direct people not to him so much as to the writers he was teaching. And this seems to have been the case in the dissertation process too, from what we hear. And it is striking that there was it is more frequent amongst the Enkelstudenten, the students of the students, or the very late students, such as Dick Zinman and myself, as to focus more on Strauss's thought, as well as amongst people, especially abroad, who encountered his writings only and not his teaching. And there was only a few of his original students who in later years, some of whom are present on the stage here, who wrote about him after his death. Well, no, not Victor was brave and wrote about him while he was still alive. Yes, Mr. Altman?
Thank you, Nathan. I'm William Altman, post-Straussian. I want to ask a question that comes out of something that Professor Zinman said. And please, Professor Gilden, if my dear former Professor Gurevich starts to respond to me, don't let him, because he's already given me a vigorous tongue lashing for the audio portion of my question. So the good book says, those that have eyes, let them see, those that have ears, let them hear. And there are two things that I wonder if any of you that knew Strauss, and I'd also pose this to his daughter, if you ever heard him, there's one thing I want to know if you ever heard him mention, and there's another thing I want to know if you ever saw, just visually saw, The audio portion comes from Zinman when he said that he had never taught a class on Lessing. And I'm very interested, thanks to the work of David Janssens. It comes out that part of what Strauss calls Lessing is really Jacobi's Lessing. And we all know that Strauss wrote his dissertation on F.H. Jacobi. We know that he calls it a disgraceful performance. I'm wondering if any of you that knew him ever heard the words F.H. Jacobi pass his lips, and if so, under what circumstances? And then the visual part of my question is, and maybe only his daughter this applies to really, is that I'm very interested in Strauss's career as a Zionist, and as a member of Blau-Weiß, Strauss clearly earned a noddle or pin as a young man, and I'm curious if anyone ever saw that. So did anybody see the Blau-Weiß noddle, and has anybody ever heard Strauss talk about F.H. Jacobi?
Jacobi witnesses?
I never heard him talk about Jacobi, but I once did ask him about his dissertation, which I didn't know what he had written his dissertation, and I also didn't know the circumstances under which he had written his dissertation. In other words, I didn't know he had written with Cassira. I just sort of assumed that he had written, with someone like Husserl or something like that. And he did tell a very funny story about his encounter with Husserl. But he just said he had written this dissertation with Cassira on Jacobi. I didn't know who Jacobi was. And he said he thought it was really quite bad. And that was it. And I couldn't, he may have been dissembling, I don't know, maybe he was just being modest, but that was it. The story, by the way, which I should tell about Husserl was, I don't know if this is true, and maybe someone else can confirm it, but Strauss we were talking about how to teach and how not to teach. This was just before I was going off to teach for the first time. And apparently he was either in or auditing a class taught by Husserl, and he had to present a paper, and the paper was, I don't know on what, and the first word of the paper was consciousness, and Strauss delivered the first word and then a couple of more words and then was interrupted by Husserl, and then Husserl just began talking and said nothing about Strauss's paper. And Strauss said, "That's not a good model."
May I then take the occasion to tell my Husserl anecdote, which I believe I also heard from Strauss, but I'm not sure, about Husserl in a seminar holding forth and pausing and said, well, I mean, let's take an ordinary example. Suppose this table exploded.
Mr. Cameron?
I'm sorry to ask a question once again, but I would be very interested. Many of you mentioned the philosophical school and the problems with the philosophical school, and I know, and probably most of you know, this letter to Jakob Klein from '49, where he says Chicago gives him the occasion, the opportunity to found a school, and I would be very interested what you think about that, and also what shape that took, and if you experienced that as the founding of a school.
I guess this is directed to those of you who were here in the late 40s and early 50s. Were you?
No.
Were you conscious of yourselves in school formation?
No.
And again, I mean,
I would like to say one
yes,
thing. I think it's not important about the questions that have been raised. So far as I can tell, the majority of Strauss's students, at least of his early students, went on to become academics in one form or another. It's students of students who became political. And if I may add this, if the results of this conference can do one really major good thing, it is to decontaminate Straussianism, quotes unquote, from vicious politicization.
Good grief.
Yeah, on this question of a school, I mean, I'm not familiar with the letter, so I can't comment on that. But I think some of the way this is presented misses what I think was the real context for Strauss, which was that, as he saw it, you know, the possibility of philosophy, the possibility of political philosophy, of the kind of life that he, and education that he received, and life that he lived, was endangered, as he saw it. His goal wasn't to conquer the world. His goal was to defend a very little island, and it seemed, I think, a very small space, so to speak, intellectually. And that, you know, we sort of miss that point if we sort of think of this as a kind of, you know, a school that is in a sense out there trying to, you know, win converts or whatever. I mean, I don't think it's anything of the sort. I think what he really felt was that the whole Western tradition of sort of rationalism, of the kind of thought that he devoted his life to, was really threatened, and that, you know, in a couple of generations it could sort of disappear. And so what he was anxious to do was to sort of make sure that at least some of what he thought was valuable in this tradition remained alive, and there would be people who could appreciate it. And when we talk about how he focused on the texts, it was because he wanted people to understand how to read these texts, how to like them, I mean, how to just be charmed by them, if nothing else, so as to, you know, a sense, keep alive a possibility of this sort of inquiry. And I mean, you know, we kind of forget about this. I mean, this has some resonances on the political side, which I won't go into either, but, you know, he was talking, I mean, he was coming from a world, I mean, from the, in a sense, the most civilized country. Germany was the sort of cultural capital of the West, in a way, 19th century, early 20th century, that had, you know, that had gone completely barbarian. And you know, the United States, from that perspective, was this country that, you know, was sort of materialist and, you know, sort of really not part of this game because it didn't even understand it. I think his own views of the United States changed a lot, I mean, from his own, you know, when he experience of it and so forth. But the basic context was an end of civilization as we know it. I mean, look at this from the perspective of, you know, 1940. And ask yourself, if you were sitting there, what would the world look like to you if you were an intelligent, civilized, humane human being from Central Europe living in 1940? I mean, that's the context. So the whole goal was to keep something alive. It wasn't to conquer anybody. I mean, it wasn't thought of that wouldn't seem possible.
Conquer, sorry. Let me just, I think what Mr. Schulsky said is crucial, that insofar as Strauss was concerned with doing what he could, and I don't think he had such grandiose notions of what he could do to keep alive the possibility of philosophy. It seems to me that it's interesting that in his way of thinking, that did not mean to advance a particular set of philosophical never mind politics, of philosophical doctrines. It was the possibility of philosophy, not one school of philosophy, and his, you know, notorious reluctance in print as well to commit himself even to philosophical doctrines in the way that Plato or Aristotle appear to do, I think has, so insofar as he founded a school, it's a peculiar school that has no doctrines and does not revolve around his work and his thought, but a way of attempting again to do political philosophy through the history of political philosophy, something like that. However, as part of this thing that several of you have stressed, of the seriousness with which he took his role in political science, obviously he launched, with the help of Herbert Storing and some of his other students, a polemical attack against positivism and behaviorism in political science that was specifically designed to change the profession, or at least to preserve the possibility of political philosophy now in the professional sense within that discipline. And that was, that was a kind of movement he was doing, but it's rather it's somewhat tangential to what he does, trying to preserve the possibility of philosophy in his written work. But that's clearly something he was doing both as a teacher and in his role. I don't know exactly what his role was in the Storing book on the essays on the scientific study of politics. In some ways, the most notorious thing Strauss wrote that caused the most ill feeling was that epilogue he wrote to that book. That's certainly my sense. Did I provoke anything more over here, Mr. Schulsky?
Well, no, just that also had a defensive side to it. I mean, that you see in all the transcripts of the defense of what he's doing as being legitimate in a political science department, because it was up against a movement that, was, in a sense, very, very aggressive at the time. In other words, I don't know how many times I heard from the fellow who became chairman of the department while I was here in the course of a little coup d'etat against the old chairman, but without going into any of that. He was just basically told by this guy that, what you're learning is worthless. I mean, that's not going to get you a job. Well, he was right about that. But, the view that this was really sort of a remnant that an advanced political science department, which Chicago wasn't at the time but wished to become, would soon cleanse itself of and, get rid of, so that it could become a real scientific political science department.
But I believe that the attack was on the Germanization of American political science. It was against Weber. Against Heidegger and Weber, not.
Strauss's attack.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
In other words, it's not as though it were against American tendencies, but against European tendencies.
Well,
that's crucial.
Yeah. No, I think, well, there was a way in which I think this cuts into the sort of the political side of it, which I said we weren't going to get into, but I mean, he also saw Western civilization as being under attack, and again, if you're looking at it from the perspective of 1940 to 1973, you certainly should have seen it. But I think he thought of it as fundamentally, the fundamental weakness that we had was the sort of loss of our own sort of philosophic groundings, and you can see that in natural right and history, and who still believes, when we say the Declaration of Independence has self-evident truths, but of course no respectable social scientist would believe that those statements are truths, or even in a way meaningful statements, let alone true ones. So that this was connected. I think one advantage of attacking this as Germanization is a sort of appeal to a certain patriotism, but he certainly wanted to figure out, I think, a way in which the American political system and American political thought could have a grounding that wasn't subject to the erosion that had occurred in the course of the development of the philosophical tradition from Locke and Hobbes and early on to Heidegger. I mean, he was very much aware that the smartest man in a sense.
Not Dewey.
What?
Heidegger, not Dewey.
Yeah. Well, right, but I mean, but I mean, the problem was to come up with a grounding for American political thought, which I think his discussions of the difference between theory and practice were very much connected with that, because he would understood there could be a practical sense in the American political founding that, maybe was a little separate from some of the theory that was running into so much trouble. I mean, it's a much longer story, obviously.
Yes, I think so.
Mr. Gill?
I think it was not so much Heidegger as the marriage between the fact-value distinction and behavioralism, which was a very powerful force that made those of us interested in the things that Strauss got us interested in look strange. And that creates the appearance of a cult, even if there is no cult. God knows there were disagreements between us.
The gentleman in front of the video camera's hand has been up for a while. You are?
Sorry, I'm Nathan Sawatsky.
Good first name.
Yeah, I agree. A student in political science at Notre Dame. The name of the conference is Strauss as Teacher, and several of you have spoken about different aspects of his teaching, how he would pay careful attention to who his audience is, and would speak simply and directly, and would really model a love of learning. And I'm wondering if Strauss himself, well, Professor Zinman has already said that he did speak to you about this, but if he said, if he ever explicitly himself described what makes a great teacher, and if he gave, some sort of systematic method for how you need to teach, that would kind of help us crystallize a lot of these different things that we've observed that he actually does. And maybe he taught about it in a class, I'm not sure, about midwifery or something, I'm not sure. But.
No, I'm afraid that Mr. Sedain is right, that this you can't say, you can only do. Anybody want to try that, Mr. Bynum?
This is anecdotal mostly, but I remember him saying on more than one occasion, there are very few good teachers. I don't think he thought that you could make one. So I think what you're asking for is not achievable. What you're asking, did he have a, for the lack of a better word, formula? No. That's what I would say.
It's certainly remarkable how many great teachers he inspired amongst his students, but each of whom had a style and mode very different from each other and from him. I'm thinking of Alan Bloom and Walter Burns, my undergraduate teachers, who were both as different from each other and from him as you could be while still being a great teacher.
Could I just say,
oh, please.
This may be self-evident, but I mean, I think he made it clear that the greatest teachers were the great thinkers of the past, and that seems to be what might unite all of the teachers that learned from him. They somehow appeal to the same texts. They may not present them in the same way, but somehow without appealing to the tradition of thought, beginning with the ancients and so forth, and not excluding the medievals and all of that, that without that, it seems like you couldn't be a great teacher in his opinion.
I wish I had brought with me, I meant to yesterday, in Eugene Shepard's book, there is this marvelous page where he recounts Strauss's first visit to the University of Chicago, where they're taking a look at him, and he gives a lecture, and some history professor, I think, is assigned to write an evaluation and says, well, research maybe, but he'll never be a teacher. So apparently he had to make, as Mr. Lerner's remarks suggested, he had to make himself a teacher. It wasn't probably something he was to begin with. Mr. Major.
Yeah, I'm wondering about if any of you have any thoughts on the extent to which Strauss's novel reading of these authors has seeped into mainstream scholarship. Is it true that it's sort of taken over? Like, does it appear in Plato scholarship, uncited, for example, or Xenophon scholarship or Machiavelli scholarship? And is it a kind of purposeful lack of citation, or is it just the sort of Strauss's approach sort of insensibly entered into mainstream scholarship?
Well, that would be a different conference. I don't know. Is anybody willing to try that on any front?
I would say a word. I may have a slightly unique perspective, being a latecomer to higher education. That is, I entered graduate school rather late in life, and as a result, I was exposed to a number of people, and I started going to conferences, among which was the Colloquium in Ancient Philosophy at the University of Arizona, which was a collection of people that worked primarily on Plato. And these were people who I guess would be considered mainstream. I mean, I have no way of substantiating this, but the majority of books that I see in print are from these, or at least articles and books. And it always amazed me how almost, how Strauss was ignored. Not just Strauss, but Klein. I don't know why. I mean, one would see all kinds of things by people like Gregory Vlastos of Princeton or people that studied with him. And I realize I have a rather limited perspective, but I'm talking about, conferences that were held regularly in the 90s and are still going on. And for some reason, he among those people, didn't seem to be cited. Whether they read them or not, I'm not sure. But they worked on many of the same texts. I don't know if someone can expand on that.
Professor Zucker, do you want to say
May I just
something?
say one word? I mean, the crucial thing really was that he taught by example of total dedication to the issues and to the text, to what he was doing. It's not method. It was that he lived, exemplified for us what it means to pursue seriously the issues and the problems. I think I mean, and a certain directness and simplicity. It's as if he had no message to teach. When I think by comparison, for instance, to a course in Aristotle in the philosophy department here, it was laying out the system. It was not inquiring into what Aristotle was doing. It was a totally different sense of what the enterprise was about. Let me say one thing, also, excuse me, but while I have the occasion to. The one time that I heard someone give a talk about Plato with as much intensity, power, and in a way insight as I had Strauss was a lecture by Berniat. Some of you may recognize the name. And I went up to him afterwards and said the only time I'd heard anything comparable was Strauss's. And Berniat said, "What's your name?"
Taking names.
Taking names.
Professor Zucker, you did want to say something at one point.
What I was going to say is I have had occasion to read quite a bit of Plato scholarship, and I do think that Strauss's influence has gradually entered. One place, interestingly enough, where you can see it is in fairly recent articles by Miles Berniat, in which he complains that the Straussians are the only ones who pay attention to the dramatic prologues.
I see. Well, you made more of an impression than you made more of an impression than you realized.
But influence is always, as historians know, very hard to trace. And there has gradually developed a consensus that the dialogues are both literary and philosophical documents. And so there are many people who say that without admitting that Leo Strauss was one of the first people to emphasize the dramatic elements.
But is it purposeful, or they just go to grad school and that's what they think it is?
I can't tell you. I mean, the British critics, for example, who cite Stanley Rosen and Seth Benedetti, but don't cite Leo Strauss.
The Hobbes scholarship, I think, has always been an exception, maybe because Strauss's own original work was more mainstream, but certainly mainstream Hobbes scholars have always engaged Strauss's work. That seems to me a clear exception. And then, of course, there's Machiavelli and Locke, where people cite it only to denounce it. There's a hand all the way in the back.
Eric Root, I just have a brief question based on what Mr. Shulsky and some of the comments from the Right Honorable Judge Blanton said today. I'm wondering if Strauss's view of America in terms of his want to say respect or appreciation of it. How could we not expect that, I guess, to transfer into political action from some of his students, or more particularly, Mr. Goryevich has said, his students?
Well, I mean, just that it wasn't presented in any type of political form, political form or political program or anything else. I mean, I would say I think that the effect on his students was in some ways to make them more patriotic, perhaps. I mean, but more importantly, though, I think it really was his attempt to understand what would make it possible. I mean, because after all, I mean, what did he see as the ultimate threat? I mean, the ultimate threat was the fact that the political philosophy and modern political philosophy had moved on in ways that seemed to be totally contradictory to the foundation of the country. So that was the real issue for him, and to sort of understand what other strengths. If you read the Three Waves of Modernity article, for instance, at the end, he sort of hints at that, and a lot of the discussion of Aristotle and the whole notion in Aristotle of the difference between practice and theory, I think, is related to that. The whole notion, a lot of the discussion in Aristotle's Politics, where the purpose of the theory, in a sense, seems to be to defend sensible practice against other theories. I mean, that kind of thing was all connected with the notion of, you know, what would be the strength of the country, the real ultimate philosophic strength of the country, in a world in which the most preeminent philosopher was Heidegger. I mean, you know, that was the real crisis for him, I think. And, you know, I mean, as we mentioned, someone mentioned the other day about talking to Heidegger. I mean, actually, one anecdote that I can tell from my own experience was, I forget how the subject came up, but he said something about, you know, talking to Heidegger, wanting to talk to Heidegger, but, you know, to meet him, I'd have to shake his hand. And that he wasn't willing to do. So that was, I mean, I think that gives you the sense of what he saw as the real crisis.
I would add a little bit. I mean, I think, as Professor Goryevich suggested, one way to think about what Strauss was most deeply concerned about at the political level was the threat of what he called the universal and homogeneous state, which he had taken over from Kojève's. I think he thought that was a genuine possible future for the West and perhaps the world altogether. And I also think that he thought that that the triumph of such a state would mean, at least for a time, the end of philosophy. I say for a time because, you know, philosophy has not always existed, and philosophy has gone out of existence at time after it had come into existence, and undoubtedly it will again. I mean, is there any genuine philosopher alive today from Strauss's point of view? I would say probably not, or at least we don't know about him or her. But there was, it does seem to me there is a question that Strauss's work posed, although I would say this was not a question that was posed by his teaching, or at least certainly not explicitly, and that is, was modern liberal democracy in itself defensible at the highest level, or was it only defensible at this more practical, the prudential level, and if the latter, was that enough? But there was also the question of whether modern liberal democracy, given the drift of modern liberal democracy, was going to be up to the task. And I think that, well, I don't see how, I think if you're a thoughtful person, you have to wonder whether it is going to be up to the task. So I don't think there was, from what I understood, there was no specific political teaching that followed from, one, the worry about the possible coming of the universal homogeneous state, or two, the worry that liberal democracy, given its drift, might not be up to the task. So I would just add that. And that meant, by the way, that Strauss's teaching, politically considered, could cut and did cut more than one way. So that, for example, some of his students, or students of students, because I think you're right, the first generation was largely unconcerned with going into public life or making a public life. And most of the people in the second generation, most of the people, even in my generation, were not. They may have been driven into public life. But there is this question, and that is, some of the people influenced by Strauss said, well, look, this sort of 2 cheers for liberal democracy won't do, because you need people who are more deeply committed, almost unqualifiedly committed to liberal democracy in order to make sure that liberal democracy is up to the task. And those tend to be the patriots, right? And again, the patriots, you can be influenced by Strauss and be a patriotic Republican or a patriotic Democrat. Now, it's true, most turned out to be Republicans, but, fair number of Democrats also. But on the other hand, you could easily come to the conclusion that the bearing of Strauss's teaching was not to turn you either into a patriot or a 2 cheers for liberal democracy person. The bearing of Strauss's teaching was that you should devote, if you were able, your whole life to trying to figure out the truth about the most important questions. And who cares about politics? I mean, I'm exaggerating.
That is an exaggeration.
Because I don't know of any student of Strauss who didn't care about politics. But I would say, I would put myself in the camp of someone who heard him more in the latter way, understood him more in the latter way, and therefore I was just never tempted to think of my life as if its primary or even secondary task was, for example, teaching my students to be good little Republicans or good little Democrats or good little this or good little that. So I really do think that different people, for good reasons, came to very different conclusions about what followed from Strauss's teaching about what your posture towards not just the American regime or liberal democracy, but what your posture towards politics ought to be, the political life ought to be.
I just may say one thing is that, but the addressing seriously the political philosophic question of the best life and trying to understand, how things had developed from in the ancient world and what the development of modern political philosophy was and the rest of it, I think that was actually not as apolitical an act as it seemed, in the sense that he did see a real fundamental weakness of the West as being this sort of intellectual incoherence. I mean, you see this in he has this one footnote in, I guess, his Natural Right to History to Hans Kelsen, who was a famous German legal scholar, legal positivist, and apparently Hans Kelsen did not quite have the courage of his convictions, if I remember this correctly, and he, in an edition published before World War II, was very clear about legal positivism, meaning whatever the law is the law, and it's wrong to say that a dictatorship is not a state of law, a Rechtsstaat, because it simply has the rule that the dictator decides everything and so forth. And then in an edition that was put out after the war, Kelsen ignored that, and Strauss has a little footnote to the fact that it's a shame that he left out this very illuminating point. But I mean that the notion that that there was a weakness that came about because of the sort of philosophic incoherence was a real weakness. And so, you know, that was, I mean, not that people should develop themselves to philosophy out of patriotic grounds, but that wasn't incompatible, in a sense, with the concern for that.
There's a hand all the way in the back in the stripes.
Ed Gramling, and I was wondering if you could provide some visibility into some of the rationales for some of Strauss's students turning their attention to say, Shakespeare, obviously most notably Bloom, and kind of what generally he thought about literature and whether he ever taught it or if that was ever a focus in his class, because it sure does seem that sort of after him, a lot of his students sort of carry on some of his thinkings in the study of literature.
We certainly taught Aristophanes. That's the only literary case I can think of offhand, and I don't know, does anyone here know the story of, did he encourage Bloom to do that dissertation? I'm not sure I ever heard.
Well, Benedetti wrote on Coriolanus very early, and I suspect to some extent under
And of
his
course Homer.
influence. Huh?
And Homer.
Yes, sure. And Jaffa's article on Lear preceded anything by Bloom, and is a very great work. And he occasionally spoke about his own readings, certainly. I mean, he had an interpretation of Don Quixote, which I remember hearing at one point, of Madame Bovary, certainly of the death scene. That's the political theological problem for him. Yes, I mean, it mattered. It was part of his life. It was not something he talked about terribly much, but it was obviously very important, very nourishing, and something he kept up with. I remember his talking about Konrad Ferdinand Mayer's The Saint and also The Temptation. Those were very important texts.
And one can see from the footnotes to Thoughts on Machiavelli that he had devoted considerable attention to Boccaccio.
That's right.
And he certainly had devoted attention to The 1001 Nights.
That's right.
Swift.
Yes, that's right. No,
But again, this may be part of the seriousness with which he took his departmental assignment was to primarily stick to, in his teaching, to texts of political philosophy, though these days, of course, political theory recognizes literature as a subfield, as it did not then, right? Mr. Gilden?
He was interested in the Henry IV, Henry V, Richard III plays. He once told me it deals with the problem of legitimacy.
We really need to end. There will be a reception to which you're all invited at the library in Ida Noyes that began 10 minutes ago.